So I'd like to thank everyone for agreeing to come and participate in this roundtable discussion. It's a very relaxed discussion. First of all, I'd like to go around and introduce everyone. Marla, during the pandemic, you were a 7th grade ELA teacher. Bill, during the pandemic, you were a high school computer science and technology teacher. Andrea, during the pandemic, you were a world languages teacher. Lisa, during the pandemic, you were a 4th grade teacher. Leanne, during the pandemic, you were a 1st grade teacher. And Tamashi, during the pandemic, you were a pre-service teacher, your first time in a classroom environment during the pandemic. So I'm sure we'll get into that experience a little bit. As I discussed before we sat down, this conversation is around creativity that came out during the pandemic. And as we discussed, a scholarly perspective of creativity is the production of new and useful outcomes as they relate to a social context. Now, for us as educators, and for the purpose of this discussion, that social context is the classroom environment. Now, usually when I'm talking about teachers working in their classroom environment, I talk about there being a box. We work within a box. During the pandemic, that box changed drastically. And just to kind of put this into perspective a little bit, in preparation for this discussion, I went back and looked at some communications that I got from my boys' school during the pandemic. So on February 24th, 2020, so just think about that, February 24th, 2020, that's where we are. There were a few key communications that I got. The first was to alert me of an upcoming multicultural festival or assembly at my boys' school. The other was seeking volunteers for the track program that was coming that spring. And then also letting me know that there would be celebration of Mardi Gras. And so the kids will be having pancakes and a whole bunch of other goodies then souped up on sugar, right? That they're going to be coming home with. Now, a week later, on March 2nd, or March 3rd rather, there's the first kind of communication coming from the superintendent's office. And that communication is obviously working to address some of the concerns that now exist for parents and the education community around the pandemic. And what it's kind of primarily putting in place is procedures for people who have been abroad, they've been traveling. But there's not really a reference that there might be school closures. About a week later, on March 10th, there is an uptick in communications. And on March 10th, we start seeing the possibility of school closures and hearing about the preparations that are taking place. And then on March 13th, or rather on March 12th, my boys' school closes. And on March 15th, the governor closes all schools until at least March 31st. So Leanne, you and I have had an opportunity to talk about this before we sat down today. So I wanted to kind of start off with you. What was it like during that first week, given how quickly things moved along?
Yeah, our principal had actually told us to start preparing packets. I work in a pre-K to 8th grade school, and they said, start preparing some packets because we'll probably be out of school for about 2 weeks. And they were talking about a little bit of what kind of platform could you use if you were home? For example, Seesaw, Google Classroom, those types of things. So we all went to the copiers and we were making packets. That Thursday, we found out in the morning that we were closing for 2 weeks, what we were thought 2 weeks. So we sent home packets with all the kids. We had Friday off. They just said we weren't going to work at all on Friday. And we just didn't know what was going to happen. That weekend, we got communication that we were to be on Zoom on Monday with our classes.
And what was that first Monday and Tuesday like during working on Zoom?
It's terrifying. I had never even heard of Zoom. So I had my home computer, my own personal old computer at home. My husband, who is very tech savvy, helped me install Zoom and kind of get that link out, which was all a learning curve for me. I was supposed to be on Zoom around 9:30 in the morning. I got my computer all ready, geared up, crashed. My entire computer crashed at 9:30 in the morning. And it was a disaster. I don't think I even got on that day.
We got an email in the morning. Take everything home. Students, empty your lockers. Teachers tell all the kids, everything goes home today. We'll be out for a week, whatever. Our district was just the opposite. No one was to go onto Zoom or Google Meets or anything because they hadn't vetted it with the town attorneys. I was on at 7 a.m. next Monday morning. My kids, they wanted to know what was going on. They wanted an outlet. I opened a Google Meet at 7 o'clock the next morning, put it in my Google Classroom so kids could find it. I had 45 kids in my Google Meet by 9 o'clock that morning. And did we do any schoolwork? No. But it gave an outlet to those kids who had no idea what was going on with their school. They weren't part of that communication train you read. They went to parents. They went to teachers. Kids were left out of that in a large respect, and they didn't know what to expect.
You're also referencing the fact that that week wasn't about going back and teaching.
No.
It was about providing support to your students.
So SEL, which was, it's been there forever, but it was never a forefront topic, became the only topic for the first 2 weeks when school went out. It was all about, how do we engage and how do we deal with that social emotional piece? And how do we teach our kids to deal with something different? You said you put the classroom in a box. The box didn't change. The box disappeared. Our classrooms weren't there. Our schools were locked. As I told you, we weren't allowed in. Myself and several other teachers also got our hands slapped. We broke into our classrooms to go get supplies because we had no idea what we really needed when we left.
We were shut down for about 2 weeks before we actually were required to go back and start doing something. We did have some meetings like with the teachers and with the superintendent. However, we were told not to do anything yet and just pause for, I think it was about 2 weeks, and then get kind of our ducks in a row and figure out what we were going to do. And we were meeting with our teams, and, parents were emailing us, and we were trying to figure out what we can do in the time being, but there wasn't much at first. And then after those 2 weeks, when they kind of opened the floodgates, and it was nonstop.
So where I was working in 7th grade ELA, the teachers all got together, the different subject areas, and we had to send home packets or practice work. For ELA, it was independent reading and some other writing practice. But for that first week, we were supposed to be giving them independent work to do at home. And we didn't do anything. The teachers were just at home waiting to hear what was going to happen next. And then at the end of that week, we were told everything would be asynchronous. We would be posting work on a Monday, weekly work, in Google Docs with links to the lessons, to the assignments. And we had to have that all up and running and ready to go Monday morning by 8 a.m. And then we would collect work as it came in through Google Classroom and interact with students online through Google Classroom or commenting features in other online work. I think right around April break time, we were told we had to offer office hours. And so we had to set our times, and it could be whatever time we wanted in the morning. And we would set up our meets, and then the students would come in. And I think it was about the same 6 people every day that I talked to. And it was never really about the work. It was, I met all of their pets and their siblings. And they showed me their backyards, and I can do a cartwheel, and look at this. This is where I go for my walk. And it was just the emotional support and the connection.
So for us, they said, prepare as if you're not going to come back for any amount of time. So I was teaching while also, but at the same time, like, keep teaching, right? Just keep teaching what you're supposed to be teaching, but at the same time, prep yourself and prep your students for a scenario where you might be at home. So all of a sudden, I'm teaching 4th graders how to get on Google Classroom on their iPad and how to type in their email address with their little fingers when they can't really know, where these keys go, and trying to get them to post something and read something and all these other things, which at the secondary level, it wasn't really an issue. But with the little ones, so there was almost like a really big barrier, and we just didn't know how to get around it because we didn't know how big it was and possible entry points, stakeholders that could help us figure out a way forward. And it was just trying to do a lot in a very short amount of time, which, if we really think about it, it's what teaching really is about. So we all knew that it was going to get done, that we were going to be able to get through it. I don't think that the expectation for teachers has been like, well, will they be able to do it? I think that the expectation has been teachers are going to figure out how to do it.
My middle son has this video game. I've forgotten what it's called. It's an iPad game. You have 60 seconds to go and grab things from the house before you end up in a bunker. And it's about surviving the bunker. It's like, it's an apocalypse type situation. You've got 1 minute. Do you grab the water? Do you grab the first aid kit? And it sounds like everyone experienced this situation where it's like, you've got this half a day to go and grab everything, but you kind of don't know what you need in order to teach under these conditions. Number one, it sounds like no one kind of knows whether or not they're going to get back in the building, whether or not that this is going to be a 2-week thing or a 4-week thing. The first week, by the sounds of it, was just making contact for some people, right? Just making contact. But then you're being asked to still teach, right? You still have to teach because we still got April, we got March, end of March, April, May. So how did you do it? Like, what were some of the things that allowed you to start beginning to teach again under these new conditions?
It became clear that I had to have 2 computers up. So when I'm not even tech savvy with one, now I had to 2, because if I was presenting my screen or what was on the document camera, I couldn't see what 29 first graders were doing. So I had to have a separate screen just to see all the boxes of children's faces, and then have my screen so that I could see what I was presenting. And that was different. Then it was, how do I teach without them seeing me if I'm showing the document or the presentation. So that was a whole new way to start thinking about, I have to teach regrouping and subtraction to first graders. How am I going to do that using manipulatives? How was I going to show that? And it was just a lot of trial, a lot of error. It was finding videos on YouTube that could teach it. It worked. A lot of it was SEL. We worked in the morning because we're first grade. We worked in the morning mostly, but I stayed on screen for snack, and then lunch. I also stayed on for lunch, and they wanted to talk. They wanted to talk and connect, because here they are, all of a sudden they're at home. If they had parents at home, they were working. The news was horrible. I mean, think about the hospitals were filling up. People were dying. Kids were scared. We were scared. It just really, it bonded us in a way. That class will forever be special because we did spend a lot of time together, even though it wasn't in the box. It was in our own way.
Your kid's video game, that was my class assignment 3 days a week. All right, guys, here's the scavenger hunt list. Find what you got at home. Here's what we're trying to make at the end. Because you're going to leave the house.
If everyone watched the movie Apollo 13, there's that scene, right? Like, at the end of the day, what's on the spacecraft is what you've got.
Into
right?
the square hole.
Yeah.
And, one of the things I do in my robotics class is we talk about aviation. What do you do at home? I'm like, guys, we're making paper airplanes today. Every one of you get your camera ready. Follow yourself around the room. Who can make the paper airplane fly through 5 different rooms today? I had people who went out on their roofs and were throwing them for 30 feet off their house and going, look, I made it to the neighbor's house. How does that count? And, just the creativity from the kids of, okay, here's a website that shows you how to make 400 different paper airplanes. Everybody pick one.
In your class, you've referenced how you enjoy conversations, group conversations. How did that play out online? Did you have to abandon that, or did you come up with kind of solutions to do that at a distance?
So one of the things that I found was improved was my one-on-one written communication with students, and they were willing to go there with me. So we used Google Classroom, so there was a lot of back and forth commenting. I used a program called Actively Learn, which they'd given all of the teachers during the pandemic the free premium version, and it was fantastic. And it was a lot of texts in there, a lot of the texts that we used, and then you could modify the questions as the teacher, so I could take out the standards that might have been placed in there and put in the standards that we were using, and ask them questions, ask them open-ended questions, and then you could go in and have multi-layered conversations back and forth on the question level. So I felt as though, while it wasn't a verbal communication until we started the Google Meets after April break, it was very robust in writing. And I felt like I had never had conversations like that with students because, you give them something, they might write you a sentence or two on paper, put a Post-it note up, give you something back, send something in on Google Classroom, which I was using before in a limited capacity. I felt like because they had the time and I had the time, we all had the time to have this deep conversation in writing.
I just was thinking about your original question about what allowed us to go to actually get things moving in some way. I feel like it just went back to the relationships that I made with students right from the beginning of the year, which without which I would not have been able to make contact with them or gotten a response from them to begin with. And once we got into the pandemic, acknowledging that like the situation that we were in, like verbally letting them know that an uncertain situation, recognizing their apprehensions and their fears and perhaps their confusion, like treating students like equals and human beings, right? Like I think that sometimes we forget to do, but really making sure that you are also vulnerable and saying like, I'm scared too. This sucks. And like, this really sucks. And if you feel that way, like it's okay because I feel that way too. And it's probably Susie and Bobby feel that same way too. And so I think that really allowed me to get to a space where I can even think about teaching, right? Like making sure my students feel supported and like making sure that they are being validated and their experiences and struggles are at the forefront. So that for me was, I guess, the avenue.
And just to build on that, this concept of the box, and I'd referenced earlier this idea that there are problems that you can address and there's problems that you can't address. And I sometimes talk about, being creative as a teacher is kind of navigating through that environment, identifying what are the things you can do, what are the things you can't do, building on the small wins. And it sounds to me that every single one of you, despite this massive level of ambiguity that exists, you were able to identify what was most important. You was able to identify what you could and couldn't do. You chose to abandon this. You were able to work with the resources that you had available to you. And every single one of you have referenced the importance of developing relationships. And I have no doubt it sounds that whether it was through a video conferencing platform, whether it was through emails, you are working on those relationships and in essence, steadying the ship. And, as a parent on the other end, I could see this, and I'm so thankful for the teachers that I saw working so hard to build those relationships and most importantly, staying flexible. I don't think I recall hearing a story of a teacher getting frustrated. There was a recognition that the computers crashed. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure it felt terrible when it crashed, but you moved on. Mm-hmm. And you moved on because you had to move on, because you had to keep teaching. So let's kind of like end that here and move on to the next part of our discussion. We're going to reopen the schools, but there's a set of procedures associated with making sure that those schools are open while sustaining COVID protocols. And Bill, you seem to have a story about this because you were involved in trying to get your school ready.
So the tech department got called in because we had some CAD skills and could draw maps of the school. And we got tasked with creating a one-way traffic pattern for our high school so that students could come in the morning, hit all 5 of their classes, and leave the building without having to cross other students or cross other classrooms.
Wow.
And we couldn't do it. But our main hallways were 22 feet wide. So there was a 6-foot strip in the middle of the hallways that was marked off with caution tape. No one could walk in those areas. And one side of the hall walked one way and one side of the hall walked the other way. So we really turned our high school into a freeway system.
I have to say, though, doesn't that sound like an awesome project you would give students?
We talked about it in our CAD class and in our robotics class later in the year. And they were like, well, you screwed up this corner and you screwed up this corner. And they gave us a lot of suggestions. They were much more under the radar of, they knew the nooks and crannies and different spots in the buildings. They knew the bathrooms that everybody wanted to use. We didn't even consider how do you use the bathrooms and how, and, because 60% of schools said, yeah, we stop in the bathroom between classes.
And during the summer months, I'm just curious, you think about how you finished the year. There's a level of uncertainty. How do you plan for that uncertainty. In fact, I'd be interested because am I right in thinking you're at this point, you're kind of going into the classroom for the first time as a pre-service teacher with your students?
So in 2020 spring, I was a junior in college. So at the University of Connecticut, they have students in placement. So I was to go to a classroom once a week to observe and just watch the teacher teach. The semester started, I was sick for a little bit, then COVID hit, and they told us to stay at home and not to go to our placements. So I didn't really get much of this classroom. So I was like, okay, that's okay, because student teaching is next this upcoming year. I'm gonna do that then.
But that's interesting, right? So again, going back to this, veteran teachers who have experience, they're able to draw of that experience. Ideally, you use the semester before your placement to conduct observations so you can get a better understanding of what it's like. But you miss that opportunity. So now you're being kind of like just thrown right in at the deep end.
Despite everything, I was ready to go. And like I said, I was with one of my old teachers, so I was excited to have kind of grow that relationship. So the summer months, we would be FaceTiming, talking about, okay, this is what we want to do. This is how we're going to go. But we have to see what the school's going to okay to whether or not you can even go, because you're not actually the staff. We don't know what their policies are. So the summer was a lot of, we're going to hope that you're going to be there, but we don't know if you're actually going to be able to come.
That must be tough. I mean, but in some ways, everyone is not in the same boat, in a similar boat, because you must have been planning for something, but knowing that something may not happen, right?
Right. Yeah. There was a lot of uncertainty, and it was a constant, well, we have to wait and see what, for us, it was the diocese, what they would say, could you be back in? Then we had to have plans. And so each principal was in charge of creating their building plan, because every building was different. There were some teachers, and I was one of them, that was on the board kind of creating the protocols for it. We had to have people come in and create tables with the plexiglass if we were going to have small groups. And then we had to have one stairway was one way up, one stairway was down, one hallway you went to the right, one stairway you went the other way. It was just a constant. And we were lucky enough that we did open that fall, and we were open, but it was a whole different ball game from what we had done in the past.
And just to kind of wrap this up, though, isn't it seems really interesting that you as teachers are now being brought in to solve some of these bigger challenges of how to open up your school safely, which is
I was happy they did that. We had a lot of discussions amongst teachers before that started, that we were like, okay, are they going to do this and even talk to us, or are we just going to show up day one and say, here's what you're going to do?
Well, it's important to have the teacher's input too, because we have so many idiosyncrasies in our day that people from the outside don't necessarily see. And if without our input, we aren't able to do our job.
Yeah.
And so it was really important that they did include our voices and that we were heard. And we weren't always. And that was we had to speak up for ourselves, and really with the best interest of our students is what we were thinking about moving forward into that school year. How can we really do our job well? Because that's what we're here to do, with all these parameters now put on us.
Mm-hmm.
So this section is named Navigating COVID Protocols. And I've got some COVID protocols. I've got masks. I've got physical distancing. I've got arrival and dismissal. I've got common spaces. I've got school numbers are limiting the number of non-essential adults, lunch, snacks, playground, recess, bathrooms, busing. Safety equipment, pre-K, before and after care, cleaning and sanitizing, shared student supplies, nursing and sick students. What else? It just goes on and on. And, Andrea, I want to come to you because you said something really interesting in your survey. You kind of said, well, we went back, but in some ways it was harder than what you were dealing with at the beginning of the pandemic, because even though you did go back, you kind of didn't go back.
Yeah, it felt well. So again, I think at that time I was trying to figure out how to teach at the elementary level, which had very specific guidelines. They were operating in cohorts, that they would travel in little groups of people all around the school. And they could not interact with one another from different classes. They in the hallway, during recess, in the cafeteria. And then at the high school, I was dealing with like half my kids physically in while the others were at home and Zoom. But then I was teaching from my desk. I've never sat so much in my life than when we came back from teaching. I usually up and moving at all times, and like I always remember being like, it feels really lazy for me to be on my butt over here while I'm trying to teach. It doesn't feel like I'm teaching. It felt like it felt like a disservice. It felt like, I saw them and I was just trying to reach to them to be like, I can help you with this technology. I just can't get close to you and I have to figure out how to do it.
And I just want to ask you one more question about your situation. As a world language teacher, you speak Spanish most of the time in the classroom.
Yeah.
So you're helping students navigate the technology and provide this additional support. Are you still speaking to them in Spanish?
Yes. So in world language education and for second language acquisition, they really encourage at least 90% use of the target language. So at the very least, like no matter the level. And so when we came back from the pandemic, perhaps I was stubborn, but I was thinking like, this is the time where we need to really enforce this because they've lost so much language while they've been away. So how is it that we sort of revive this practice? And so for me, to walk a student through how to use technology in the language that they know is one thing, but in a language that they don't know is a completely different challenge, right? And I was adamant that I was just going to do it in Spanish, and that required for me to support them with visuals. So I created extensive slides. If I anticipated a direction or some word that I knew was going to be problematic for them to understand, something that was not a cognate, right? Something that they just couldn't make sense of. I would say it out loud and I would time this word with a visual that was color coded with the word written out in the same color as the visual, right? So like they would hear it and they'd be like, I don't know what that means, but here comes flying in this picture of what it is that she's trying to say. And immediately after that, I would have a slide where they would annotate, like on their iPads with their fingers, because we had iPads for all students, like, did you understand this? And they would like annotate, like, I understood it. I understood a little bit of it. Can you say it again? Or I have no idea what you're saying. So like, it just helped me gauge like how much of my directions they were really able to internalize. So those became like, I remember teaching for the 4th and 5th graders, we have 25-minute classes 3 times a week. And those 25-minute classes with this sort of visual support became like 30 to 50 slides per 25-minute class.
I really felt like the box had become so much more rigid when we went back to school that fall. In the spring, we might have been apart, but we were able to connect. We were all a little bit more relaxed. No one was having to follow so many rules. And it just became for me all about the rules and the protocols. I remember 6-minute passing periods because we had to wipe down every desk before the students left the room. And we couldn't let them leave. And they were in cohorts and they were going to the next room down, but we had to wipe down all the desks from the people before they left, before the other people came in. So I feel like I cut off so much of the learning to do that. And we were so focused on, are they wearing their masks the correct way? Are they staying 6 feet apart? We'd have to constantly tell them. Then we had the mask breaks every so often. I remember going out 3 times a day at least.
I think the structure was needed to pull things back in, but the pendulum was swung way too far to the other side where there was a concern that if we don't do this right, we're going to have to close again.
Yeah. Yeah.
And who's going to get blamed for that when it happens?
Yeah.
You knew what the rules were, you knew what the protocols were, and you followed them as best you could to make sure it wasn't your part of the building that caused a problem.
It was stressful. It was stressful, not just teaching in that kind of environment, but you were worried about the health. Like, gosh forbid you were the one that, spread a COVID to somebody or your class went out. And it was the constant cleaning. I think in that email was sent home, you had to teach your 1st grade and kindergartners how to open everything.
Yeah.
Because I shouldn't have to come to your desk and open your jar.
Yeah.
That was how, at the beginning, that's how it was. Could we pass papers out to each other? When kids passed papers in, we were letting them sit for 20 minutes, or 2 days, 24 hours before I touched them to correct them. I couldn't sit at a desk because I had to remove my desk, because in order to fit all the desks, I had to lose all my bookshelves, all my desk, and it was nothing but 1930 rows of children as far apart as they could be. And then I was up at the front of the room, but I was a first grade teacher. How am I not supposed to be next to that child? And we were talking about language, and I was thinking about you teaching language. We had masks. How was I supposed to teach phonics and reading with these masks on? So again, it was going back to videos. It was using, I believe it was a series of speech teachers who were teaching kids how to make sounds. The TH is a, I couldn't show that with my mask. Or an F is a, there are different things that we teach in first grade that now I had to find different ways to show that, because they couldn't understand if I was saying fun or them. They couldn't hear that difference for a spelling test. There's
a lot of fear.
Yeah.
For me, there was a lot of fear. So we were very rigid. We had to follow those protocols because we were so scared. And then it was back to your point about the teaching practices. Like, we know what good teaching practices are, and we weren't able to do that. And that was really difficult. And we had to find different ways to teach. And it may not have been good teaching practices. And that's what's hard for us as educators, because we want to do our best and do well. But there were so many levels to every day walking into that building. You're so happy to be back in person and be with your class and your colleagues who you relied on for so much, but then you were so scared because what's going to happen today? It was really unpredictable too, and uncertain. But you still had to go forward with your day, and you had to show up every day with a smile on your face and not show fear and not show uncertainty and say, we're okay. Everything's good. We got this. Don't worry. And, it is good because we taught our students that mentality. Like, we're going to be okay. We can get through this. But it was not okay. For me, at least internally, I had a lot of stress, a lot of fear, a lot of turmoil during that time of being, back in person with mass, and being a good teacher.
Yeah. From a parent perspective, it's interesting to hear about that, the fear that all of you have shared about not being the class that's sent home. Reflecting back on that experience, every time those letters came through, I was like, oh, no, please, please, please. And it would say, if you're receiving this letter, that means that you wasn't one of the classes that would be sent home. But I never, ever thought about it from the teacher's perspective, about not wanting to be the class that is sent home as well.
See, at the high school, we weren't a cohort. I still saw 65 students every day.
Yeah.
And they swapped classes. Our school went as far as, for our computer labs, anyone had a computer science class, they had their own keyboard and mouse they brought to class with them. And you unplugged it from the computer and took it with you when you left.
But you're talking about a hybrid. You've got a hybrid approach going on, which I have to say, that must have been one of the most challenging situations. And it sounds like almost, because you were talking about Zoom at one point.
We were hybrid. So we were hybrid at the high school, and I was all in person at the elementary school. And because I occupied both spaces, and then Wednesdays we were remotely at the high school, but I was teaching at the elementary school. So I would have to be on Zoom for my classes at home. Then I had 25 minutes to get from home to the elementary school to teach my 4th and 5th graders, who one class might have been in quarantine, so I was teaching them on Zoom, and then so I was all over the place, literally all over the place.
Trying to handle 15 to 18 students in your classroom and another 15 to 18 on Zoom at the same time. And after a while, it got easier because at least what I found to do is, when I had them in class, I prepped them for what they were going to see once they got home. So in actuality, what I do is I pick 2 or 3 kids that got whatever topic we're doing. They presented from home. So the kids in classroom were interacting with the kids at home. And I sort of just moderated instead of trying to teach it. So, if you didn't get the students that were on Zoom or Google Meet from home, they sat there and just listened, and they got nothing out of it unless you could find a way to keep them in it, because you couldn't interact with the 15 in the classroom and interact with the 15 at home at the same time.
It's impossible to give them online and in person the attention that they both deserve.
Yep.
or that they needed. And it really depended on the personalities of the children online versus the children
Oh, yeah.
in your classroom. But there will be times where you just don't know where to start. Like, where should I go first? And I keep going back to that good teaching practices. Like, how can I have good teaching practices with my children who are on Zoom or on Google Meet, but also have good teaching practices with my students who are in person?
We've got to bring you in here because, this is your first time in a classroom environment. I mean, tell us some of your stories. What does that look like?
Yes. And then you talked about some of the communications from the schools about safety, what we're doing. And so part of that, you mentioned like non-essential adults. So unfortunately, as a student teacher, I qualified as a non-essential adult. And so I think it was maybe August when that was like settled that I would not be going in person for that fall semester. And so the way my student teaching was set up for the fall semester, you go in once a week to observe, get to know the students so that in the spring when you're teaching, you're already part of the class. So right off the bat, already not part of the class. So I was like, okay. So I was living off campus. I was living in my apartment. And my school was hybrid. I was at the same school as Andrea. So half of my students were at home and half of my students were in person. And so what me and my cooperating teacher ended up doing is we decided that everyone was going to be on the Zoom, whether you were in person, whether you're at home. So I was on the Zoom from my apartment. My students were on the Zoom from the classroom. The other half of the students were on the Zoom from their house. So I had one screen with my students on the Zoom, one screen of the screen that I was sharing with my students. And then I had my iPad in front of me where I would be writing to like simulate a whiteboard for them, explain whatever chemistry thing we were explaining. My cooperative teacher was great. So he would be in person. He would set up the labs for them. I would do the instructions and my students who were in person would like set up their camera so that at home people could see them do the lab. Then I would like hop in the breakout rooms from my apartment saying, hey, how's the lab going? And they would be doing the thing. Yes. About 2 weeks in, I'm already over it. And so I decided that, you know what? And me and my students or at least I had acknowledged that I know this is a tough situation. My students who are in school aren't even getting their in-person teacher because I was at home because they have the student teacher. So I decided to start celebrating Friday in my classroom. And so every Friday I would send out this Google form on my classroom and it would be like, the most random questions. It'd be like, one would be like, how's your week going? And it would be a series of memes. And then it would be like, what's your favorite song, or what's your favorite show, or do you like artificial banana flavoring? Like the most randomest questions. And I would send that out on Friday. And I told them, if you do it, you can check a box at the end. And if you want me to reply, I'll reply like to all your answers. So every week we started doing that. And it was the sweetest thing ever because my students would go off on these forums and tell me about like their boyfriend. They'd tell me about like how everything's crazy, or they'd tell me just about how their sister is being annoying this week.
I do have to bring this up because it's not just your story, but I think you did a really good job of kind of talking about all of the different solutions you developed to the problems that you had to face as a new teacher. But if you listen to all of the stories that you've just been sharing, going back to this box concept, within that box, there are problems that we can't address. There are constraints as well. Here is the constraints. We talk, in the field around this idea of creativity and constraints. And if you listen to your stories, you're identifying the constraints. You're having to work with the constraints and develop solutions. And so you're there recognizing the importance of developing a relationship, which we've all identified as an important part of teaching. And you're coming up with these strategies on how you could do that. And this is the type of creativity that I thought, at least from that parent perspective, that I was seeing emerge weekly. It seemed that you as the teaching community kept getting better at engaging students from a distance.
I think they got better going back in the fall of 2020 because I'm a tech integrator. On top of everything else, I was trying to teach teachers how to connect with their students through the tech when we got sent home. And for me, when I was teaching teachers, I'm like, oh, hang on, I'm changing to this screen. And they're like, what do you mean this screen? Most teachers had no concept. It was one computer, one screen in their classroom. So when we initially went home, that was a really hard thing to deal with. And I'm like, okay, do you have a second laptop? Well, yeah, it's not very good. Great. Plug it in, join your Google Meet. Well, why would I do that? Well, That one you're going to see your kids on.
Mhm.
This one you're going to present on. And that aha moment a lot came across when you're talking with teachers. Now, when we got back to school, teachers were starting to figure it out. And even though we were still hybrid and even though we still needed things, now IT was, hey, I need a machine that can have 3 screens on it in my classroom. Or I need a second Chromebook that I can have at the other end of the room so that when I'm teaching, I can watch from this side and see my kids when I'm on this side of the room. Even though my main computer's 10 feet away and I can't see anything on that screen, I need something else I can see with it. So that there was definitely a technology change. And I would say even the most technology scared teachers became much more tech savvy.
But we had a lot who helped each other.
Absolutely.
Teachers really, not only did we realize the relationships with our students were so important, but the relationships with each other was so important. And, we did have teachers that had been in the building for, 30 plus years who didn't use the computer besides sending emails home. That, was basically there. And now all of a sudden they had 5 students who had chosen to be distant and now had to film everything all day long. And it was a collective help of how to get it running, how to get it up, how to help people learn about this new technology. And I think that we really realized that importance of mentorship and help and sharing what was working and what wasn't working in the classroom.
All right, so I want to kind of bring our discussion to a close now. And as part of that closure, what I'd like you to do is to think a little bit about some of the solutions that you've developed that are still in place today. And then also how the experience has perhaps changed how you view your teacher agency within your classroom environment. So, you had referenced that you still use one of your solutions today. Could you kind of tell us a little bit more about that?
During the pandemic, I had my students do that Google form. It was called, I think, like literally just about me. Mm-hmm. And so now in my classroom, we do what we call a journal moment. So every Friday, I'll put a prompt on the board. My students will journal and then they can put it in like this bin that's Miss TRT responds. So a lot of my students have me just respond to like the most randomest things once again. And it's a really sweet way for me to connect with them, to some of my students who don't really talk that much in class. Sometimes I'll be like, I didn't write anything, miss, but can you just write something back to me? Mm-hmm. And it's the sweetest thing. So I do that. We used to make these study videos to help for the tests. I still just make those and just post them. And so that's not something I don't think I would have done. But with Zoom, like being able to have the study guide here and I can talk and write on it, it was great. So I still use that. And a lot of just like the flexibility that came with the pandemic, I try to still bring into my classroom, because I think sometimes as teachers, we forget our students have a whole life outside of our classroom and we don't account for that. And I really try to bring a lot of that I did exercise in the pandemic, like still to this day, and try to.
Like you said, videos. We recorded most of our Zooms and our Google Meets because there were kids who were sick and they had to be able to come back and check in. I still do a lot of flipped classroom stuff. Screencastify is great. You can talk. You're the little head in the bottom, and you can show your screen and talk about different things and do whatever. And I didn't think I would continue it. And I still probably once or twice a week throw something up, even if it's only 2 minutes, as a review from something that happened in class, and put it up in Google Classroom. Say, hey, watch this before you come into class tomorrow. It's going to be a discussion point.
Definitely the flexibility, and also, I was already using a lot of technology prior to the pandemic, but in a more limited way. And now Google Classroom is an integral part of my actual physical classroom, whether it's, like you were saying, giving them, posting things like that they missed. Everything that I do is kind of marked on Google Classroom, and it's just an extension. You can, if you were out, I think really what makes me do this is that I'm so worried about the student who's going to be out for several days or even one day. I mean, we're so used to that during COVID that even when we came back, that people might be out for 5 days or 10 days and miss everything. So now everything goes up. It's just every day is kind of like a record. It's a running record of my class. Now it's just, if you missed it, go look on Google Classroom because everything's there. If we do something on paper, there's a digital copy there that you can either come get a copy from me or print it at home. And the flexibility definitely with the deadlines, absolutely, that definitely continues.
I think Andrea said something before about you constantly had to anticipate a problem, what was going to happen. And I think that with the pandemic, I'm better at that. I'm better at thinking about a lesson, thinking about what is going to be difficult for them, and coming up with those solutions, whether it's going to be adding a video or the step-by-step teaching that I had to do, where are they going to have difficulty with it. I think that back then, every night I was working on the computer to create the next day's slides or activity and to really think about them at home and what were they going to have, because I wasn't within that reach of them. To me, that physical reach was so important and I couldn't do it. And for that, I think I'm a better teacher.
For my situation, my students were the main source of inspiration and motivation and the ones that helped me problem solve. I think that if anything, what I heard across the board from administrators or just people that were, sitting in an office telling us, mandating things for us to do, over and over, we would just hear like, we don't have the answers. We don't have the answers. We hear that these are issues, but we don't have the answers. So then I remember being like, okay, we just had an hour meeting where we were just given a space to say everything that's wrong and then told that we have no way to help you figure this out. So I leaned on my students to help me problem solve, right? In terms of like, how is it that we're anticipating issues? How is it that we are differentiation, like what that even means? Like we are redefining student success. We are redefining what it means for students to be engaged, right? And where I went to have more clarity was to my students. They helped me because they're the ones that tell you like, this could have been a really, really pretty presentation that you did, but it did nothing for me, right? And even though somebody else might have vetted it, somebody else, whoever was doing PD was saying that this is the latest and the best, your students were coming at you saying like, no, it's not cutting it for me. And so for me, like being able to problem solve with all these hurdles meant that I had to be intentional about creating a space where my students felt that they could share how they were experiencing like learning.
Big takeaway from this as well is what all of you were saying is that teachers are incredible problem solvers. Is that we were thrown into a problem that no one else had been thrown into before, and we solved it in multiple ways and were successful. To whatever measure you want to measure your success. But I would say that every single one of us and every single teacher was successful in some way. So that the problem solving, I think, for me is at the forefront, where now I look at problems differently in my classroom. And I don't look at them as like, oh, I don't know if I can do this. It's more like, okay, now how can I do it? And what avenue can I go? And who can I tap into to help? Like our colleagues, you had mentioned, Leanne, like what colleagues can I lean on to help me build that problem and solving it? So teachers are incredible problem solvers. No matter what the problem is, we solve it.
I think pre-pandemic, though, our problem solving was a lot more reactive.
Yes.
To seeing and reading our students, seeing their behavior, seeing their body language change, seeing the things we saw in that personal space. And when the pandemic hit, we had to flip that switch and become proactive problem solvers without knowing or trying to anticipate the different avenues things were going to go, without having that spatial cues and visual reactions that we could get from being with our students.
And I think just to kind of summarize what I've got from this discussion, and I think it connects a lot to what you're talking about, the importance of relationships with your students, and of course, as you referenced, Leanne, relationships with your colleagues and within your community. And within those relationships, whether it was the beginning of the pandemic or it was over the 20 or 21 academic year, there seems to be greater awareness of the student needs and how the students are reacting to the actions that I'm doing in response to the problems that I'm having, and a flexibility and a willingness to make adjustments because of the feedback that you're getting. And I like to think that we as educators can continue to take some of these things and continue to utilize them in our practice as we go on to, as you alluded to, some of the challenges that we might now be dealing with post-pandemic. So I want to thank everyone again for agreeing to come and participate in this discussion. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. It's been fantastic. And I look forward to hopefully having another one of these in the future.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.